Hey everyone, I'm Tyler Mays-Childers, Senior Product Marketing Manager on the Azure Synapse team, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our sixth Ask the Expert session for Azure Synapse influencers. I'm joined today by Sunil Sabat and Abhishek Narain, who will be answering all of your questions on data integration security in Azure Synapse. These Ask the Expert sessions are intended for our active Synapse influencers, so if you somehow snuck in here and haven't already signed up to join the program, you can still do so at aka.ms/Synapse influencers. Invite your friends, your colleagues, your mom. It's free to join. Just some housekeeping to start. First, ask your questions with the Q&A function in Teams. If you submitted a question when you registered, we'll do our best to answer it in the hour we have today. Some questions we'll put out to answer live, and other questions we'll answer in the chat. Do try to stay on topic. If you ask questions that are not about security, we'll do our best, but we may save them for a future Ask the Expert session. Your team's name is shown when we answer your question in chat, and we'll try to give you a shout out if we answer your question live, or you can ask your questions anonymously if you'd like. We are recording the session, just FYI. We have been sharing these a couple weeks out, just so we have some more show folks the great content we're creating here. Last but not least, if you'd like to be sent some of our new swag, we've seen a lot of folks excited about getting their swag. Just ask a question in the Q&A window and share your social details in the chat, and we'll send you a DM to give you the code to redeem your swag. You can also email us if somehow that was too confusing or didn't work. You can email us afterwards at synapseinfluencers@microsoft.com to claim your code. Now, I am pleased to welcome, again, like I said, our experts for today, Abhishek and Sunil. We also have a couple chat moderators. I'm going to quickly flash this slide up, who are helping out in the chat. So thanks to the whole team here. And we're going to kick off here. I think, Abhishek, you're going to go through just a few kind of slides to get us talking about security in Synapse.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tyler. And thanks, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this session. It's awesome to see you guys. And let's quickly get started. So in this whole topic, as Tyler mentioned, we'll start with, a few introduction to kind of best practices with respect to data integration and security. So in this topic, what we would do is we'll quickly go through a few key things which we think is extremely important as a data integration practitioner using Synapse and Azure Data Factory. So we'll go through those, and then we'll get to the questions and answers. And during this time, you also have an opportunity to put in questions through the chat, and we can answer those questions later point in time. So quickly getting started with few of the security considerations, which typically I talk with customers, is few things you have to do. Security comes during the design. So while you're designing your data pipelines, while you're designing your whole architecture around data analytics, your security needs to be thought through right from the beginning, right? Secure by design. And so few of the considerations that you have to bring up while starting with your security design is how do you authenticate? Because to be very specific, when we talk about data integration means you had to connect to various different sources and destinations, right? So there's a lot of connectivity that's going to happen. Authentication is extremely important because you are running in a shared environment. By shared environment, I mean shared workspaces. These workspaces are shared between multiple users of the same organization, right? Typically. So you have to be careful how you use. You don't have issues regarding privileged access permissions. These are very common terminology in the security world: elevation of privilege, privileged access, and these are the things which causes most of the data breaches amongst all organizations. So if you want to make sure that there is no data breach issues or concerns, make sure you go through all these security considerations. And I think the first one to start off with is the authentication part. You have to make sure that the lowest privilege permissions are granted to whoever is accessing the data. right? And we highly recommend to use managed identities to do the authentication. And the reason behind that is managed identity, when you compare it with a basic auth or a user auth or a service principal auth, is managed identity is basically an Azure Active Directory capability, right? It's an Azure Active Directory application, which is basically a managed experience for end users and customers. And each instances of your Synapse workspaces will have a dedicated managed identity. So it's a per resource scoped identity. And this is where we are starting off saying you have to be secure by design, you have to give the least privilege. And since you're doing this data integration from that resource, you would provide the minimal privileges to this managed identity across the different data stores that you're connecting to, right? And that would probably be the best approach. But we do understand there are scenarios where managed identities are not functioning. For example, you're connecting to an on-premise Oracle server, right? And scenarios like that. We'll talk about how to make sure you apply the privileged, least privileged kind of principle across there too. So we'll talk about AKV and other things slightly later on this chart. But that's very, very critical that you, whenever you start your design, use managed identities and scope it to the least access that you want. If, for example, accessing data on Gen 2, make sure it only accesses that specific folder that it needs to access, because this is a common pattern that in data lake world, remember earlier days when we used to use access keys for a storage account, and you ended up leaking out or giving permissions to anyone who has the access key with them. So we don't want to get into those issues, and that's why we have ADLS Gen 2 with RBAC capabilities. So make sure you make good use of managed identity and role-based access control, and contain the permissions to the very minimal that is required in the whole workspace. Now, the second part is the network isolation. It's extremely important. It helps you in terms of securing you against man-in-the-middle attacks. So things like when you have, it's a very common terminology in networking world, where you are there can be someone who is spying over your network and then can misuse the data that is going out of your network, and that's typically called as a man-in-the-middle attack. And with managed virtual network, what we are doing is, even though the network on the Azure side is managed by Azure, and the chances of man-in-the-middle attack is extremely lower, but then even then we have this capability in Synapse, which is managed virtual network. It does provide two layers of isolation. One is a compute layer isolation, and then additionally a network isolation as well. All the compute that is being used, the Spark compute, the data integration related compute, are all isolated here. That is one benefit. The second benefit is the network is isolated as well, and the communication between the compute and the data stores happens to private link, which we call it as managed private endpoints for the managed services. And for the unmanaged services, where you host your own private link service to expose your own data sources, we call it as private link. So this enables and makes sure that all the communication that happens between the data integration service and your data sources happens through a secured or a private network. And that's extremely key in making sure there's no man-in-the-middle attack. And then we also have a private link for the UI, for your data engineers and data scientists and business analysts who are using the Synapse UI. They can use the private link, and it's called as Synapse Private Link Hubs. And they can use the Synapse Private Link Hubs to access the Synapse UI securely from their virtual networks as well. And that can make sure that even the UI authoring part is secured there. That was the network part. So we covered authentication, network. The metadata is always encrypted. The pipeline metadata that we have in Synapse Analytics is always encrypted. And if you're using CMK in Synapse, it applies to the metadata encryption that happens in the pipelines as well. And what we mean by metadata is the pipeline definitions, the connections, the link service definitions. All these definitions that we have we encrypt it using, additionally, we encrypt it using your key. We always encrypt it using Microsoft keys, but we can add another layer of encryption using your own keys. So this saves you against, let's say there's an invader in Microsoft subscription, which is highly unlikely, but in such cases where even there is a compromise on the side of Microsoft, your data or your metadata is still secure due to this double encryption. So it gives you just a additional layer of confidence. We are very confident this, you would never use this. I mean, you would never need this, but then having this option to do an additional security on top of your data is extremely useful, and it'll give you a good night's sleep. And then the fourth one is the credential management. There are, as we said, if you're using managed identity, you don't need to manage credentials, because managed identity is like a managed application, which magically is paired with your resource, and it's kind of coupled to your resource, and you grant permissions to that. So there is no credential in play. So there is no data breach related issue concern where you give credentials to a data engineer. The data engineer left by mistake. That credentials is now leaked out or misused outside of the scope of the resource, which is Synapse Analytics. So you never run into such issues with managed identities. Now, for those data sources where you do not have managed identities, or which do not support managed identities, like let's say Oracle, or let's say SAP system. Now, these are the critical part here to secure your credentials and make sure that these credentials are not accessible by your data engineers and business analysts. For dev systems, it's fair if you use a basic auth, but your QA and prod systems, it's not recommended, because production systems and granting permissions to production systems to all your data engineers and business analysts is not a very good practice, right? Because it can be misused. You are kind of leading towards misuse of your credentials. So this is where Key Vault comes in. And in Azure Key Vault, you can store these credentials. The admin can put in all the credentials in Key Vault. It helps you easily rotate these credentials if there's kind of a leak of a credential. And at the same time, in ADF world, ADF now, or Synapse Analytics now, uses managed identities to connect to the Key Vault. So you are in a way now not exchanging credentials with the data engineer. The data engineer is still using the managed identity and needs a permission to access Key Vault. And once that's granted, the data engineer and the business analyst are all using Key Vault without knowing the credentials or connection strings of the Oracle or the SAP system. And this is an awesome mechanism on how you can convert those data sources which do not support managed identity into a mechanism where data engineers always uses managed identity in your Synapse Analytics. They never use any credentials. They're never exposed to any credentials. So this is my favorite way of recommending to customers how you would hide any credentials that are needed in data integration behind a Key Vault and then reference it from ADF without having to expose these credentials to any user in your organization. And you can do CI/CD very well here, right? Because the production environments typically would not have access, the users would not have access to those, and you can always switch the key vaults to dev, to test, to QA. So it works out very well with CI/CD as well. Now, moving on to the fifth point, which is data in transit. So any data in transit that happens with respect to data integration, we always use TLS 1.2, so that the channel is always encrypted, even when we are using it using the private links, right? So it adds additional layer of security, depth in defense, and that's what we need to follow, right? Defense in depth. So adding additional layers of security, which is channel encryption on top of network isolation, is the additional security feature capability that we offer. But if you're not using managed Vnet, you still get this feature in the public network as well, using TLS 1.2.
I just wanted to acknowledge that question was actually asked by VMU Relic Kraju in about whether Synapse allows data encryption in transit. So thanks for hitting that one, Abhishek.
Perfect. And then moving on to the next one, this is data at rest. And so since data integration does not store your data, it never stores your data, right? It always moves the data, but we know that Synapse Analytics is a combination of tools, right? Data integration, data warehouse, Gen 2, and things. And hence, data stores encryption at rest capability, which like each of these data stores, like Synapse Data Warehouse, and then ADLS Gen 2, the data lake Gen 2, all of them provides a capability of encrypting the data at rest, and it also leverages CMK to do a double encryption. So as long as you have CMK configured, and as long as you have these SQL DE and Azure Blob Storage SSC enabled, you are well covered for data which is at rest to be encrypted additionally as well. So that covers your data at rest encryption. The final thing I want to talk about is since the first 6 are always good practices, and we hope that you follow that, but at times even us make a mistake, right? Like miss out on one of them. And that's where the 7th item comes in, which is Azure Policy. So Azure policies are intended to kind of restrict or make sure or govern your resources, that the resources are using the right things that they should be using, and they aren't misusing anything. So you can write custom policy. There's a bunch of built-in policies already. Like we have policies which ensures this data exfiltration mode is on Synapse. Data exfiltration mode is kind of making sure that there's no public outbound communication for which kind of risks your data exfiltration. Someone by mistake or a malicious user kind of exfiltrating the data out to their public or unwhitelisted or across tenant resources. That is what we already solved. But how do you implement it in a way that as an admin, that all your data engineers are following those rules, right? And this is where Azure Policy comes in. Policy helps you kind of govern, make sure you set up a rule, and all the resources in your subscription has to follow that rule. Otherwise, it'll be an alert that will be raised, or they'll be blocked in creation of that particular resource. So it's extremely important to use policies to make sure you enforce, you govern your resources well, and so that all the above points which we talked about, using the right authentication mechanism, using key vault, using the data in transit, you don't have to do that. That's implicit. But anything which is around like data exfiltration, you can have a policy and enable those policies, and you can have policies work in 2 modes. It kind of enforces you to use that, or it raises an alert, but not enforces you. So you can allow basically production. I would imagine you would always enforce it so that nothing goes wrong. In dev, you can kind of be slightly easygoing and say, I want to get an alert when someone is misusing it, and you can get in touch with that person. So you can manage the way you would like to manage, but these are kind of my 7 criteria that I would suggest any customer to kind of consider while doing data integration security. And if I would not go much into details, we already covered that in the previous slide, and we can probably have some way of sharing these slides with you as well. So these are just going a little more in details, talking about managed identities. But if we all are good with managed identities, we understand that, I'm more than happy to skip this slide.
We do have some questions coming in from the audience, so I would love to get to those. One came in, how do you run Synapse notebooks securely in Synapse pipelines?
Yeah. So let me, so let me talk about how the things work, right? When you call a notebook, a Synapse notebook from pipelines, what we do is there's something that is happening in the pipelines, which calls the notebook endpoints. So we use the managed identity, again, coming back to the topic of managed identities. So when you are orchestrating, let's put it in the right words, when you're orchestrating a Synapse notebook or a Synapse Spark job definition from a pipeline, we are already leveraging the service credentials, and by service credentials, I mean to say the managed identity of the workspace that's assigned on the workspace. So it's using that implicit trust, the managed identity, and that managed identity is being used to authenticate into the Synapse Spark while submitting the job. So we use already the best practice here. You don't have to pass in a credential. of a user. There's no user credential required. So we already implement or enforce a best practice that managed identities are actually calling your notebooks from the pipelines.
Thank you. That question was from SQL Nathan. Thanks, Nathan. This question's from MNOH Limits. When do you plan to support private endpoints in SHIR when using Synapse pipelines? It's only supported in ADF right now.
That's a good question. I'm not well caught up on the roadmap, but I think we can maybe take this offline and follow up.
Yes. So again, so the plan is end of the current year 2022. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then Tim asks, is there a way to ensure that interactive authoring uses the private endpoints? As far as I am aware, using, for example, the preview data feature in a lookup, the data is being transferred using public endpoints.
So this is specifically being asked on the SHIR, if I'm not wrong?
No, this is from a different person, Tim. Is there a way to ensure that interactive authoring uses private endpoints?
So yeah, so let me answer that. So if you have enabled
Policy.
a managed Vnet, if you have enabled a managed Vnet in Synapse, and then when you use interactive authoring, when you turn that toggle on for interactive authoring, we basically use a compute which is created already in the managed Vnet. And that is used to connect to your data sources for doing any schema API calls, like test connection, or when you do get data preview and any of those operations. So it is already working in that isolated managed Vnet, and it's already capable of connecting it through the private endpoints to your different data sources. That is already functional today.
Yeah.
Great.
And also I'd like to add that you also can enforce, right? Even for get metadata, the source, you could make sure, like Abhishek talked about Azure Policy, that source is always a private endpoint. So you can design, just to make sure that you can always connect to private endpoint. Yeah.
Great. Erwin asks, how should we handle data encryption? Any great use cases, or do you have any best practices? Sunil, you want to take this?
See, if you come to like the what like Abhishek talked about, right? So we give security, this encryption at different layers, right? If you come to say Sql Pool, dedicated Sql Pool, right? We have this always encrypted option, right? And then we have this TDE, transparent data encryption scheme, right? So those are it has to Sql Pool, and then on top of it, right? If you want to say again going to Sql Pool, right? We have a masking, data masking, procedure also, right? On top of that, if you use this Synapse pipeline, you can do kind of, we now support, like you can use some NLP data, right? You go to some cognitive service with REST service and mask some, you can find sensitive data and dynamically mask it, and bring it back. So we offer several techniques, to encrypt, data at rest, and also dynamically, mask, with encrypt with the REST service. Okay. Yeah.
And just to add on to that, what Sunil said, when you're thinking about data encryption, keep one thing in mind. A very good practice around that is to start your encryption at the beginning of creation of the resource, right?
Yes.
So when you create a resource, that's when you have to come up with a plan saying, I'm going to use this encryption key and the method of connection. Like, for example, when you say encryption and you're talking about workspace encryption, not the data layer encryption, but the workspace metadata encryption, you have to do that at the beginning of creation, like when you create the resource, rather than when you have already added a few things and don't enable CMK. After that, you will run into issues because some of the metadata that we store across the workspace artifacts are already not encrypted, right? Though I haven't myself tested it, but I would never recommend doing that in the middle of the phase. Always start fresh and start encrypting, because that's one criteria I would put as a best practice. Do it at the beginning. The second one I would say is, when you're using encryption key, be aware you're talking about additional encryption, the key that you bring. Never lose this key. Never delete a reference to this key from the resource. There is no way for Microsoft to decrypt it. There is no way for anyone else on earth to decrypt it unless you hold the key carefully. So many times it happens, we hear from customers that they have deleted a resource. They have deleted a key vault, right? The key vault contained the key, and they were using that key from the key vault to, use CMK or, encrypt and decrypt the metadata, right? It is such a simple step for a customer to kind of delete such resource, or if not the resource, we'll try and block deletion of such resources. But let's say if you delete the key itself, we have no way, the APIs will not be able to decrypt it. So you have to be very careful when you implement CMK. That would be my second best practice suggestion, is whenever you use encryption, decryption, make sure there's separation of concerns. Let data engineers handle the stuff that they do well, and let the network and security guys handle the stuff that they do well, which is kind of handling the encryption keys, rotating the encryption keys, and things like that. Don't mix the two up. If you are a small team and you understand that both the sides well, it's fair. But it's always good to have someone like a security expert to handle the keys and make sure the keys are always available. It's rotated at the right time without breaking any workspaces. That handling of the keys is very, very critical, because even, trust me, Microsoft cannot help you recover that data if it's being encrypted by your own key.
Thank you, Abhishek. We have a question from Ada Silva Tech. What are the best practices for data exfiltration in Synapse? Did we cover this by chance?
No, we can talk more about this. So in case of Synapse, there is a special capability, and again, you would rather do this during creation of your Synapse Analytics workspace. There's a feature when you enable a manage Vnet, there's a toggle or a checkbox which says enable data exfiltration, allow only a trusted tenant network there, and that is exactly what you need to enable to ensure that you do not misuse any endpoints in ADF. For example, I can talk about a scenario that you're using a managed Vnet in Synapse, and you're reading the data from your data warehouse through the private endpoint, and then you end up writing the data out onto a public blob storage, right? It could be a mistake, right? Or it could be a malicious user in your workspace, right? Either cases. Now, how we prevent such exfiltrations by mistake or by purpose is by enabling that flag which says, when you create a managed Vnet based workspace, say enable data exfiltration. And what it does is it disallows any public endpoint connections from the managed endpoints. Anytime you try and read or write into a data source which does not have a private endpoint on it, or is not in that specified tenant, I would not say or, I would say and, not in that specified tenant, it will basically not let you connect to that particular data source. Even if it's a private endpoint to another tenant, it will disallow that, right? So that is the level of data exfiltration support that we already have. And we have some interesting stuff coming up as well. For example, today, you can also add your own data exfiltration rules as part of the Azure policies, right? How would you do that? You can create a new Azure policy, and you can set up, say, I only want to allow in this particular type of link service. Let's say this is a blob storage link service, and I only want to allow one or two different FQDNs over there, which is kind of one or two storage accounts, but nothing else, right? So you can write a rule, an Azure policy rule, which will validate whenever a user tries to create a connection to any other blob storage endpoints, it would kind of fail at the creation of that process, right? So you can write those additional custom Azure policies as well to take this top notch, one notch ahead, and make sure that you kind of create literally an allow list rather than saying use only private endpoints, do not use public endpoints. Rather, you can actually go ahead and say, I want to allow through this connection, this kind of link service services to be created. Within this kind of link services, only these kind of domains to be called out at. So that's the level that you can go deeper with Azure policies and define those custom Azure policy definitions for.
Yeah, Erwin just clarified, he meant more the encryption of the data so that the contents of the data cannot be read by anyone without a key. Masking can still be made readable for certain user groups, while masked data cannot be used as a key. Does that help clarify?
I would have a follow-up question on that. So this is specific to, is it data obfuscation related stuff?
Yeah, I think it was
at the data store.
I think it was, if you go a question back, we were talking about keys.
Yeah, so these have two different aspects, right? One, we were talking about data at rest, and these keys are being used to encrypt data at rest so that any attacker does not see this data or find this data readable. That's one thing, and it's transparent to customers or clients, right? Clients can access that. Then there is additional security capabilities in SQL, which allows you to say this column should always be encrypted.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So it provides that level of deep encryption capability as well, so that when the client or the customer reads the data, they do not see that particular column of data. It's encrypted unless they have additional keys which they pass them through to decrypt that data.
Yeah, so again, adding to what Abhishek said, right? So the dedicated SQL pool, this comes with both row level security and column level security. So you can have your own keys. You can create using SQL pool. There are scripts. How can you assign a key and reuse to encrypt and decrypt, right? Actually, on top of that, we have something called TDE. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. I think so. You can see my screen right here. So this I wanted to go through. So here I want to show everybody, right? So I created this workspace, with manage Vnet, right? So this is my manage workspace, right? It kind of opens up a lot of security postures for you, right? And for example, right, you want to create private endpoint connections, from your workspace, right? It gets enabled, right, along with the interactive authoring when you create this workspace, in a managed Vnet, right? And you set up when you create it. Now coming back to the encryption point, right? You can see here, right? So the SQL pools in the workspace can be encrypted with a second layer of encryption, with the service managed keys. Okay, so you control those keys, right? And this is the second level. TD is the second level encryption on top of, right, what the the SQL pool comes up with, right? Row level security. For that also you can have a key. Column level security, you have another key. Okay.
Cool. Thanks, Sunil. Okay. We have a question in from John Laurent. Hi again. Welcome back. Is there a way to give permission depending on the network that the user is connected from? For example, a contributor when connected through a managed Vnet, but only reader when using a public network. And maybe, if not, this is a great feature idea.
Yeah. It seems like a good feature idea of doing a controlled RBAC based on the network. Yeah, that's a good feature idea. I would recommend you to add this into features.azure.com. Maybe we can paste the feature link. That's a very good idea.
Great. Thanks, John Laurent. I'm going to go back here and see.
So this is feedback.azure.com, okay?
Feedback.azure.com. We have another question from Ada Silva Tech. Actually, this is kind of a general do's and don'ts for securing Synapse. I don't know, Abhishek, if you have more in your deck you want to go through, this might be a good time. Or Sunil, I know you have a couple slides too.
Yes. Let me share my screen. Abhishek, you want to quickly go through your slides, then I'll go through my slides. You want to do that?
Sure, I can. I'll just take a couple of more minutes. The few things I wanted to talk about is when we specifically talk about data access strategies from the Vnet, few things, and it might be quite small on the board, but I'm just going to run at a high level. These are the 5 points, right? The way you can connect to outbound data sources from the data integration aspect. One is you should always use private endpoints if there is a way to use private endpoints, right? So that's all clear. Sometimes we hear from customers that, for example, you have a SaaS endpoint, right, sitting somewhere or on the Amazon side, and you have to do the data integration. And that's where you would need things like IP addresses to be whitelisted. Now, we do have a range of IP addresses that are integration runtime. We call it as Azure integration runtime, and we expose that per region. But that would not be a single IP address. It'll be a huge range, maybe hundreds and thousands of IP addresses per region, which are shared across multiple customers for sure, right? So that is one option of doing that connectivity with a SaaS provider or a provider outside of Azure. I wanted to touch base on that. So what are the best practices? Of course, private endpoints ruled out from there, unless you build a custom PLS endpoint and things like that, which is possible, but then typically private endpoint is ruled out. So the second best way to do that is also using an SHIR, where you can get a dedicated static IP on that IR. So you aren't really saving man-in-the-middle attack here. It's still going through public internet. You can do additional VPNs if you wish to between the two clouds, or if the SaaS provider supports something of that sort. But then static IP is also one way of saying that you are using a self-hosted integration runtime, and it has a dedicated static IP, and you whitelist that IP in your sources where you are trying to connect to, like SAP system or any other SaaS endpoints that you have. Typically, all the data stores support that. Then the third thing is, let's say if they don't support that, allow listing of IP address, then you only have, you also have something called service tags, but these are applicable for hosted solutions on Azure only, because service tags are basically an Azure concept of, specifying IP ranges by a service, and we do that for Azure IR, and you can use that to whitelist in a hosted application on Azure only, right? This is Azure only relevance. And then the fourth one, again, which is Azure only, is trusted service firewall exception. So we as a service have a implicit trust relationship with, it's not implicit, it's actually explicit, with things like Azure Storage and Azure Key Vault. So there's option on Storage and Key Vault which says allow trusted services. And when you check that box, you are basically allowing the managed identity of these services like Synapse Analytics and ADF to access those Key Vault and storage endpoints using the data integration, the pipelines. So this is not certainly a secure option, and I would never recommend this, but this makes data integration much more simpler. So based on what kind of data you are dealing with, based on what your security requirements are, you can use trusted services. I would certainly kind of rate this like on a security level on a lower side. And then finally, the public endpoints, which is allowing everything to, this is kind of, I make fun of it by saying it's a full trust mode. You trust everyone in this world, and you open up all your data sources to everyone in this world, and then rely on authentication and authorization to kick in to help you secure your data stores. So this is what the approach used to be a decade back, but then we have better things to do. Top 4 things are always a better option. So I would use the last option, which is always allow all services using public endpoints, as the last resort or option on the data integration side. So that's all I had. And one last thing I wanted to cover is, this is slightly more technical, but then this gets asked by a few customers where they want to encrypt a few fields additionally. And by encrypting, we mean the metadata encryption, not the data encryption. So like, for example, in the connection or the link service, many customers have asked us, oh, for me, the table name is a secure thing. I don't want other data engineers or other users of my resource or my workspace admins or monitoring agent users to be able to see my table name, because that's very, very secure to my organization. The table name itself contains certain value which should not be used publicly. And the whole point of putting up this slide is our app model is so extensible that you can use any field, and additionally using the JSON, you can encrypt any of these fields, and this encryption takes care of the CMK as well. So if you have a CMK encrypted Synapse Analytics or ADF workspace, all you have to do is, against that property name in the JSON, you just have to mention type as secure string. So the moment you change the type as secure string for a given property in your link service, we will automatically encrypt the value of that property, right? So in this case, you can see there's a table name, dbo.source table name, and I set the type as secure string, and automatically the payload after when you retrieve the payload back, you will see that that value is never shown. So which means that it's always encrypted using your keys as well. And at the same time, there is no user in the factory who can exfiltrate the name of that table or that particular property, right? So this gives you an additional control. And I think this is like an extra thing I wanted to show you. This is a fun thing. Be careful, because you will not be able to figure out the name of the table ever after you encrypt it. But then this is very useful and asked for in the production environments where people kind of want to encrypt additional properties and fields in connections as well, which are not by default encrypted. So this is more on the metadata encryption side. And I think that's all I had. And back to you, Sunil.
Yeah.
And Tyler.
Yeah.
Thanks, Abhishek.
So thank you, Abhishek. So Abhishek went through, went over like the data integration and network security and workspace security, right? What actually I'll go through a few slides is, in general about the SQL pools and then some managed Vnet setups, right? Which we'll use in overall end-to-end scenario. Okay, hopefully you'll find them useful. Okay, yeah. Okay, you can see my screen, right? So this one, right? Synapse has something called IP firewall rules, right? And so you can use a firewall. I know Abhishek talked about how you harden your workspace, right? But in a lot of enterprises, right, they love controlling the access through firewall rules, and so you can IP firewall rules and grant or deny access to user Synapse workspace based on originating IP address of each request. You can control that, and once you set it up, this applies to all public endpoints of the workspace, dedicated SQL pool, serverless SQL pool, and development. I know there were some questions, from insiders about how you control access to dedicated SQL pool, serverless pool. So the IP firewall rules is one of the ways. Okay, any questions, Tyler? So, and the key points here, customers can also use SSMS, and you can, so with IP firewall rules, still, customers can use SSMS, and then and they must ensure that the firewall on the network, local computer allow. Only thing you have to do is, the 80.443 and 1443 for Synapse Studio. Those 3 ports need to be opened up. Rest, you can control, all the, all the ports with this IP firewall rules. Okay. And then Synapse Studio needs the UDP 53, and then that needs to be open. And to connect using the SQL tools, SMS and Power BI, you must allow outgoing communication for 1433. Okay. And then, as you know, the SHIR, became available in Synapse recently, and Abhishek talked about this, right? You can, so you use SHIR as one of the security tool, particularly when you connect to your on-prem data sources. Abhishek talked about, how can you use a static IP for an SHIR node, right? And you can definitely allow SHIR to access, your on-prem Oracle or on-prem SAP or SFTP, it doesn't matter. Okay, so we can use SHR extensively for security, for on-prem access. And then one thing we touched upon is about using managed Vnet, right? As I showed you one demo, right? I have created Synapse workspace with managed Vnet, right? Which gives you more access to more security postures of your Synapse workspace, right? So these are the steps, right? What are the benefits of using managed Vnet? We talked about it, but I'm just listing it here. You can offload burden of managing Vnet to Azure Synapse. Customer don't have to configure inbound NSG on their own VNets because we'll be managing Synapse workspace, right? In actually in a custom VNet, okay, in your subscription, okay. So we want to manage it from my side. It is mostly because we have to enable you, serverless Sql Pool. We have to enable for you Spark compute. We have to enable for you data integration compute, right? There's so many compute stories, we have to manage, and plus to run all the Synapse workspace, all the artifacts, we need a lot of metadata access to, Cosmos DB, logic apps, many. So we want to, host it, inside your subscription. Customer don't need to create a subnet for your Spark clusters because, as I talked about, right? Because we'll be running in a managed VNet, in your subscription, and we'll provision compute for you, right? Unlike other products or other things, right? You will start the Spark cluster, you will assign, right? That we'll do it for you. Okay. And then also we talked about data exploitation. Again, this is a technique. You use a managed Vnet with managed private endpoint. It protects against any data exploitation. Okay. So if you manage Vnet with Synapse and use private endpoints, which you can enforce using Azure Policy, what Abhishek talked about, we think data exploitation protection is guaranteed. Okay. Yeah. So these are the ways, right? You enable it here, right? And these are the private endpoints. I showed you in the Synapse, managed workspace with the security. I show it here again. I can go back here. This is my managed Synapse workspace, right? Managed private endpoints. You see, for my managed Synapse workspace, I've created these private endpoints. These are all approved status. I have, I have private endpoints for block storage. And I have my Synapse workspace Sql Pool, Sql on demand. Even for Sql on demand, which is serverless Sql Pool, I have a private endpoint. So this is the this is the data exploitation in Excel. That's what you're seeing. I have a managed Vnet Synapse workspace, and I'm all my sources, destination, and private endpoints. So I'm going to demo that to you. Okay. So this is so dedicated SQL Pool and server SQL Pool can use multi-tenant infrastructure that is not deployed into a managed workspace VNet. So this is what I was talking about. So I talking about private endpoint, but you can have because you're running the managed VNet Synapse workspace, right? So these SQL pools, they'll be running inside this managed VNet workspace. Okay, this again, you can create private endpoints. I showed you in the demo, right? I have for both SQL on demand and dedicated SQL Pool, I have private endpoints. Okay. So again, focus back to data exploitation. That's the highest priority for any enterprise on the earth today. So with the managed Vnet Synapse workspace, with managed private endpoints, and with Azure Policy, I know Abhishek can add a lot more, but your data exploitation protection is kind of guaranteed. Okay. So this is it. Yeah. Tyler, that was my presentation. Okay. Some demos and some concepts. Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
I'm on mute. Sorry. Erwin has another question. When will shared SHIR be available for Synapse?
Abhishek, you want to take it up? It's a roadmap, but yeah. So this.
Yeah, it's on a roadmap. I'm not sure on the timelines, but we can take it offline.
Yeah, yeah. So as I told you, right? So this year, the SHR and Synapse can new now work, making work across different workspaces. These workspace could be managed workspace or not. And there are a lot of security concerns, data exploitation, and we need to open these 4 ports, right? So there are a lot of internal security hurdles we have to get through, to be making it shareable. Okay. Yeah.
Cool. We have a few more minutes, so get your questions in here. John Laurent. Yes, I think you have your swag. I think that is the swag. There's not any new swag for 2022, but who knows next year. We have a question. How do you handle data anonymization in Synapse pipelines and data flows?
So I will take it up, then Abhishek can add. So when you do, for example, right, if you Synapse pipeline copy, right, we usually don't support the custom, masking, the encryption, compression functions, right? But we support like bzip and zip, like there are 4 or 5 in the Synapse pipeline copy, right? Those come out of the out of the product, right? And then when you use the Synapse pipeline mapping data flows, we support that SHA 256 masking. Okay, so those are the 2 things. And I also talked a little recently that you can use our we have a template with both in ADF in Synapse pipeline, where you can do a REST call to cognitive service, right? And then you find the sensitive data, and then do some encryption. That's the encryption is a service, but for that you use the REST service, from mapping data flows, right? But said that, right, this semester, the coming semester, at least for the mapping data flows I'm talking about, right, we're coming up with a file level encryption decryption as a part of mapping data flows. Okay, but over time, right, we also want to offer row level and column level encryption, right? If you connect it. So those are coming, but right now, as a part of this semester, we're working on from the mapping data flows, right, the file level encryption decryption, where you can give different algorithms.
And just to add on to what Sunil said, in mapping data flow, we also have this capability called external call transformation.
Yeah,
and to be specific, when we talk about data anonymization, that what can be better than a cognitive services, right? For anonymizing data. Then we have another option. I think there's one more PII and anonymization template that we have added into our template gallery for masking and anonymizing. So whatever you need. So you have that template available in our template gallery if you search by these keywords. And that's basically using Microsoft's own homegrown anonymization algorithm. Then you have the integration with cognitive services. We also have a template for that, for mapping data flows, where you can mask that data. So these are 2 options that are available. We are also working with a partner on this respect to provide a solution that will happen in the next semester or so. So you will have 3 options. You already have 2 options for anonymizing data. That is using Presidio, to be specific, that we pasted down. So Presidio is Microsoft's kind of open source library for masking and anonymizing the data. And we have an integration. The integration with mapping data flows might be missing, but then they do support row level transformations, API calls, which we can make from mapping data flows using the external call transformations, and we can anonymize the data. And cognitive services template already functions. So all you have to do is just click on the template, get the API key for cognitive services, and you are good to go with the cognitive services integrations. These are kind of 2 ways on how to do anonymizing and masking with pipelines. And the 3rd way is going to come up shortly.
Yeah. And then I just put in a URL for our PII data masking, a template. Okay. That we shared with you. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Sunil. I will pass that along. Cool. We have one question here. What are the best practices or maybe the nuances between securely ingesting data from on-premises versus cloud environments?
I'll take that one up. So for the best practices on how to securely ingest data from on-prem environments, I would say use self-hosted integration runtime and use express route if possible. Express route kind of helps you save that from, again, man-in-the-middle attack. What it does is it builds a secure and a private connectivity, which an ISV kind of dedicates. So you get a network or private channel from your enterprise network to the cloud, which is Azure Virtual Network. So it kind of builds a secure and a private network path between the two. So there's no man-in-the-middle attack that is ever possible. It's dedicated, so you get a dedicated quality of service as well in terms of the performance of the data moment. Multiple packets, multiple customer packets are not sent through the same network. That's the key thing. So if you're doing on-premise data ingestion, and if you can have a private, there's a dedicated network express route setup system in there, then you can have SHIR hosted either on-prem or on the cloud. I would recommend put it on the cloud because you have a dedicated network which connects to your on-prem source. So you can have that. You can even replace that SHIR with a managed Vnet, and we do have a tutorial, and Sunil can paste that link as well. So you can even do some plumbing and replace the SHIR with a managed Vnet via the express route. So you can actually do you can do a on-premise data integration securely using managed Vnet without having to manage a self-hosted integration runtime, right? So that would be an ideal situation. But then there are a lot of moving parts here. You need express route. You can replace the express route with the site-to-site VPN as well. Now we are talking a lot more networking, but these are all these options. The site-to-site VPN will guarantee that your channel is always encrypted additionally using the VPN, but it will go through your ISP, internet provider's network. So there still could be a man-in-the-middle attack, but it's secured via VPN. So that you have that safety there. But then the QoS is not guaranteed because it's happening through an ISP, right? So that's the only difference between express route. It gives you a high quality of service. The VPN relies on your ISP's terms. So that's the difference between the two. But you can certainly do the plumbing of network. That is more important here to do secure data integration. And that can be securely done via express route or through a site-to-site VPN.
Yeah, and then some customers are using the managed Vnet, what Abhishek talked about, without SHIR. But the beauty is, we've been talking about private endpoints. That's what they do, right? They connect to the on-prem source using managed Vnet with network plumbing, and they create a private endpoint because it all happens to private endpoint, right? Though there is chance of, as you said, you go through your ISP or something, right? But if you go through somebody like Equinix or somebody, right, you are ultra secure, right? Still, those are almost having like SHIR. Okay?
Cool. Well, we're running to the end of the hour, so I wanted to thank Sunil and Abhishek for all of the discussion and everyone who asked questions. Thank you for all your participation, and I hope you all learned something new that you can use in your daily analytics and data work. We're dropping a short survey into the chat window, so please take a minute to let us know what you thought about today's Q&A and which topics you'd like us to cover in future sessions. We're also running a wider survey on the Synapse Influencers program, maybe 5 minutes, and we'd love your feedback to help us continue growing and improving the program. So we'll drop that link as well. Thank you in advance for filling that out. Registration for our next event will be opening shortly, so please visit the website soon, aka.ms/synapseinfluencers, and keep an eye on our Twitter posts for an announcement when that goes live. On October 19th, we'll be joined by Sevilla Gitlin-Troina and Uri Barash, who will be answering your questions on Azure Synapse Data Explorer, Azure Data Explorer, ADX, which is very exciting. And if you haven't yet signed up for Microsoft Ignite, that is October 12th and 13th. And I know we're going to be making some exciting announcements there in the data and AI space as well. So perhaps on the 19th, we will follow up and have some questions where we can talk through those exciting announcements. If you haven't already done so, please be sure to follow us on Twitter at Azure_Synapse and tag your Synapse related posts with the hashtag Synapse Influencers and Azure Synapse so that other community members can easily find your content. And if you have questions related to the program at any time, feel free to drop us a line at synapseinfluencers@microsoft.com. Thanks again for joining today, and we hope to see you again on October 19th. Thanks, everyone.